Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar brought to you by Birds Caribbean, the Bahamas National Trust, and Environment for the Americas. I am Lisa Sorensen, Executive Director of Birds Caribbean, and your moderator for today's webinar, whose theme is Restore Habitats, Restore Birds, Native Plans for a Bird-Friendly Yard. This webinar is in recognition of International Migratory Bird Day, also known as IMBD 2015. IMBD is often celebrated in Canada and the US in spring when birds are migrating north for the breeding season. Here in the Caribbean, we celebrate in the fall, especially in October when we welcome our migrants home. The aim of this festival is to bring attention to one of the most important and spectacular events in the Americas, global bird migration. Our first presenter for today is Mr. Scott Johnson. Scott is the Science Officer for the Bahamas National Trust and Media Relations Officer for Birds Caribbean. We are also joined by two distinguished panelists, namely Dr. Joe Wunderle and Mr. Pericles Maillis. We are also supported today by Ms. Portia Sweeting, Director of Education of the Bahamas National Trust, who will help us coordinate the online PowerPoint presentation. Please join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag IMBD2015. Okay, so just some light housekeeping before we get started. All of our lines are muted, and we invite you to submit questions through our Q&A panel on the right side of your screen at any time during the presentation. And kindly note that we will be posting a copy of all the slides to our website, which is birdscaribbean.org. Birds Caribbean is a nonprofit membership organization that's working to conserve the birds of the Caribbean and their habitats through research, education, conservation, action, and capacity building. We would like to invite everyone to visit us on our Facebook page and also to become a member. Much of our core funding and activities are supported from donations from members and supporters. This webinar is part of our free activities offered in support of engaging ordinary citizens in the love and conservation of birds, and we look forward to your continued support in our activities. All right, so we're excited to have Scott Johnson presenting for us today, and I will now turn presenter's control over to you, Scott. Welcome.
Okay, thank you so much, Lisa. So today's presentation is entitled Restore Habitats, Restore Birds. We're keeping up with the theme for this year's Birds Caribbean for this year. And the subtitle is Native Plants for a Bird-Friendly Yard. Next slide, please. So the Caribbean is an amazing archipelago. The Caribbean is an amazing archipelago consisting of three major sections. You have the Bahama Archipelago, which is the northern part of the Caribbean. You have the Greater Antilles, which includes Cuba, Hispaniola, which is Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico and Jamaica, and you have the Lesser Antilles, which are the smaller islands on the left-hand side of the archipelago, or the leeward side of the archipelago. Next slide, please. So, the Caribbean, just to tie in with the Caribbean again, the Caribbean is an archipelago in which hundreds of millions of birds fly through every year to their wintering and breeding grounds. And so with migration, a lot of people hear about this word but don't really know what it really means. So we're going to talk a little bit about migration. Click, please. So migration is the seasonal movement of birds from one geographic area to another. Each year, hundreds of millions of birds fly down to the Caribbean and to South America. And they fly, some of them fly hundreds of miles, some of them even fly thousands of miles. For example, the Arctic tern can fly as much as 30,000 miles every year to go from the Arctic to the Antarctic. But for many species of birds, they're flying thousands of miles. There are three main types of migratory birds. You have the short distance migrants, the medium distance, and the long distance migratory birds. But we usually lump migrants into two categories. You have the summer migrants, and those are the ones that come to the fly up north in the spring months. And then you have the winter migrants, the ones that come down in the fall. That come down to the Caribbean in the fall. So right now we're going, the fall migrants are coming down to the Caribbean. And there are two main reasons for migration. One is for food, and the other is for nesting. During the fall migration, the season is starting to change, and so food is becoming more and more scarce in the northern parts of the bird's range. So many species of birds head south to feed. And in the nesting part is for birds that are coming, that are heading back up north. During that time, the season changes. Spring comes about, and during that time, there's an abundance of food for the birds to support themselves and their developing young. Next slide. So, prepping for migration. Before a bird migrates, there's some key things that happens to it. When the bird senses that the seasons have changed, whether it be a long day period, as in the spring, or as a short day period in the fall, something triggers, something affects the birds. And it's a hormonal change that occurs, making the bird behave a little bit more differently than how it usually behaves. These birds tend to go through a process which is called where they start eating a whole lot more food during this time because they're prepping for migration. So they start to build up a whole lot of fat. And the fat can be displaced to various parts of the bird, including the eyes and around the breast. And all this is the bird's getting ready to leave. And many species of birds also go through a molt period, in which they change their feathers during this process, during this season. So some people ask, well, how is it that these birds are able to migrate to these various places without any use of equipment? But in actuality, all of these birds that are migrating with the use of very interesting internal navigating system equipment. So some birds, for example, well, most birds that are flying, they usually fly at night. And when they're flying, they're using the stars, they're using the moon, they're using the sun to help them navigate south. And they also use the Earth's electromagnetic field as they move south to their wintering grounds. They also have an internal map system. Many species of birds will be called site faithful, which means that every year they return to the same spot that they were in, and they have this internal map system built in that helps them to navigate to that spot that they were in the previous year. While birds are migrating, they encounter many dangers. The migrative period is not a safe time for birds. And one of the biggest dangers to migratory birds are predators. Cats, for example, are big predators of birds. They kill billions of birds every year. Another threat to migratory birds is using green energy. Solar panels and wind turbines, windmills, for example, kill tens of thousands of birds every year. As these birds are flying through, some of them may hit the windmill and die, and then other birds, when they're flying over these large solar fields, the heat from the solar fields can actually cause them to spontaneously combust. And that could be dangerous to many species of birds. So thousands of birds end up dying because of these green energy things. So with other migration problems that a bird can other migration issues that a bird can undergo are skyscrapers. Skyscrapers and building and windows kill tens of thousands of birds every year. These birds are flying through these large buildings and hitting the windows, and because of that, they end up dying. And then storms are another big issue with birds. The storms, as these birds are migrating south, they may encounter a hurricane or other type of large storm, and the storm could kill them outright. It could remove their vital food sources, and the winds can blow them in different directions. And as well as hunting. During this time, many people are out hunting for birds, and many of the ducks and other species of waterfowl and other birds become victims to hunters. So with all animals, every animal has basic needs, and with birds, it's no different. So the three basic needs that a bird needs are food, water, and shelter. And they can find all of these things in the habitat that they live in. Next slide, please. So what is a habitat? Well, a habitat is an environmental or ecological area that is home to a particular organism. So click, please. It is also, another name for it would be, another definition would be the natural area where a species live and the physical area surrounding a particular population. So in the Caribbean, we have numerous types of habitats. You have pine woodlands, you have wetlands, mangroves, you have dry forests, you have seashores and mudflats, rainforests, mountainous regions, and scrublands. Next slide, please. So there are also many environmental problems that birds have to face when they're heading from their breeding range, heading to their wintering range, and vice versa. One is with things like global warming. You could encounter that areas that once had a lot of rain will experience less rain, and this less rain can be a problem for these birds. Another problem would be soil erosion. When people bulldoze habitats and remove not native plants, that actually can disrupt the soil balance. That could have a negative effect on the soil, which means there's nothing there to help to keep the soil stable. So when it rains, that the soil washes off from the area, and that could lead to mudslides and other things. Well, also, when you remove species from native plant species, you actually open up the door for invasive plant species to to establish themselves in a habitat. I just mentioned global warming and how global warming is negatively affecting many species of birds, and as well as pollution. Throwing garbage in various locations as opposed to in the place that they need to be can contaminate habitats and make things worse for birds. So how can we help? There are many ways in which we can help birds while they're migrating through to the Caribbean. One is to provide food. There are many ways in which we can do this. One of the ways in which we could help to provide food would be to set up bird feeders. Like, for example, the hummingbirds use these nectar feeders, and other species of birds use these other types of bird feeders. And that can assist the hungry bird that's flying hundreds of miles to gain some strength to continue their trek down south. If you want to, you can also be very creative with producing a bird feeder. You could just use simple household products to help to make very nice bird feeders that do the same purpose, which is help feed hungry birds. Plant bird-friendly native trees and plants. When you plant these species in your yard, you can assist birds as well as make the yard a lot more attractive. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into this. I'm going to leave this for the panelists, but I just thought that this would be a slide that would be of interest to everybody with regards to native plants. And these are just some examples of native plants you can find throughout the Caribbean that birds use, as well as used in human consumption. Next slide. Organizing tree plantings is a great way to build relationships with people and build a community, as well as assist many species of birds. By planting a whole bunch of native plants in your neighborhood, you add a lot of biodiversity to the habitat, which increases bird diversity, making the habitat a lot more healthier than it is. Okay. You can also transform your yard by just using different types of plants and just strategically placing plants and in different areas. You can enhance the beauty of your yard as well as increase bird diversity in your yard. As well as gardens. Many people like to time in their yards. They like to add plants to their yards to beautify their yards. And just choosing the right species of plants for your yard can not just add beauty and charm to your yard, but also can make the yard more better for birds. Next slide, please. And there are many online sites that are great for helping to augment your knowledge of what species of plants and what format you would like your yard to look like, which would increase wildlife in your yard, native wildlife in your yard. Next slide. It's also very important that if you are going to beautify your yard, and if you want to make your yard a lot more bird friendly, you may want to add a water source to your yard. Many species of birds, especially during the dry season, which the Caribbean will be going through for the next few months, water is going to be a little bit more scarce, so just helping the birds out by placing water dishes and stuff in your yard would be great for many species of thirsty birds during the winter season. Removing invasive plants is a very good way to help a habitat and as well as to help birds, because the invasive species can crowd out other native species, thereby decreasing bird diversity and decreasing biodiversity in the area. So by removing the invasive species like casuarinas, Brazilian peppers, in places like the Bahamas, casuarina, Brazilian pepper, and melaleuca are considered invasive. You can add to the diversity of the habitat and therefore increase bird diversity. Next slide, please. And you could also assist in cleanups. Removing trash from areas can help to keep the environment healthy, which also increases the chance of native plants being able to regrow in those areas, which then increases bird diversity. So helping out and also builds community. So by helping to clean up your neighborhood and clean up areas, you help birds out and you also help the community out and the environment. Next slide. And one of the biggest ways in which you can help migratory birds is to support local environmental groups. So assisting by supporting groups like the Bahamas National Trust, Birds Caribbean, the Wunderle National Trust, and other organizations, the funds and the time that you allocate to these places helps us to continue the work that we've been doing, which is helping to maintain and establish new habitats and protect new habitats that are vital for a lot of these migratory birds that are coming in and leaving.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Scott, for that informative presentation. I think we already have several questions in the queue. However, I'd first like to introduce our panelists and give them an opportunity to speak on the topic of native plants for birds before we open up the floor for questions from our audience. We have with us today Dr. Joe Wunderle. He has spent over 30 years conducting avian field research and teaching throughout the Caribbean, including 6 years in Grenada and the Grenadines before moving to Puerto Rico. He taught zoology at the University of Puerto Rico for 8 years before joining the U.S. Forest Service International Institute of Tropical Forestry, also in Puerto Rico. His field research focuses on migrant birds and their conservation in the Caribbean, and in the last 10 years, he has concentrated his field studies in the Bahamas, where he and his cooperators have studied the endangered migrant Kirtland's warbler and its winter habitat. We also are pleased to have with us today Mr. Pericles Maillis. Mr. Maillis combines a distinguished career as a senior lawyer in private practice with a passion for farming, fishing, and outdoor pursuits such as gardening and landscaping with native plants. A seasoned conservationist and past president of the Bahamas National Trust, he's an outspoken advocate of the wise and sustainable use of the Bahamas natural resources. He is a self-taught botanist with many years of practical experience and has worked on many research and restoration projects on the Bahamas flora and fauna over the years. So, my first question to our panelists today is, why is it important to use native plants in our backyards and to restore habitats for birds? And Pericles, I'd like you to comment on that first, please.
Lisa and everyone, good morning. The thing about the need to restore in backyards is to remember that in nature, before man did all its development and interference with nature, your migratory birds and your local birds had vast forest areas that provided everything Scott talked about: shelter, food, and water, and food for fruit eaters, insect eaters, and nectar eaters. However, we build cities, and we're forever expanding suburbia into natural areas, and sometimes it happens overnight, and so the birds are coming back to stark, desertificated landscapes, housing developments with just buildings and no trees. And so now we're talking about the process of mitigating and ameliorating the destruction of man and making backyards a happy, beautiful place again for people as well as for birds. And if we don't go back into our yards and plant trees for ourselves and for birds, then that part of Earth ceases to be of any value to bird life, and the natural areas may be too far away. Their homing clocks might be so imprinted on particular areas that before they can go and find new habitat and new areas, they perish from hunger or thirst. Some migratory birds are coming ashore exhausted, literally at the end of their endurance, and they need food and water fast. And if there's a hurricane coming and they manage to make it to land, they need thickets and hedges and shelter. So anything we can do to plant to help provide the basic needs within areas that human beings are messing up, but we also have a right to be. So whatever we can do to make our gardens backyard habitats, they're called, all important. Now, a bird's not going to treat your lot and your garden as his sole ecosystem. He's going to go from one tree to one garden, across boundaries, across fences, and so forth. But individually, we have to work at it, and neighborhoods, we have to work at it, and as town councils, governments, and so forth, and try and make suburbia and urban areas as bird-friendly as we can. And if we do, then we will have the joy of seeing these birds right in our midst. And to get poetic, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. How's that for a summary?
That is excellent, Pericles. It's very inspiring. It makes me want to run out and head to the nursery right now. So Joe, can you comment for us, please, on why is it important to use native plants? Why not exotics? I mean, what's so special about natives? Why are they better for birds?
First, I want to compliment Pericles' description. It's hard to come after Pericles. But one of the reasons we want to be careful with exotics are particularly what are known as invasive exotics. These are ones that can escape from our yards, our gardens, and colonize natural habitat. And some of these exotics are very invasive. Think of casuarina, for example, and they can take over a site such that the site can't be used by most native organisms. Very few birds will occur underneath a casuarina forest, woodland. The same concern with lucina or jumbe bean. They can take over sites. Very few birds use those areas. If we plant them in our gardens, they escape from our gardens. They can move into the wildlands and become a threat. And the advantage of the native plants are that, one, they're native, they're adapted to the location, and the birds and other organisms are adapted to them. So that's one of the strongest reasons for using native species. And another reason for using native species is maintaining a cultural heritage. Many of these native species were used for medicinal purposes, for teas, and a lot of our knowledge of the use of these plants is disappearing as people move into the suburbs and become more urbanized. So one of the reasons for using the native species is to preserve our Caribbean cultures, where in the past people used these native species.
Okay, excellent. That's a many great reasons to think about planting natives. So let's move on to one more follow-up question. So, are native plants best for both residents and migrants?
Can I just add to Joe's comment?
Sure.
The other reason that we encourage people to use natives is that they are really climatically adapted here. And so just as in the north, when the winter sets in, the trees shed their leaves because the ground's going to be frozen, and it's a water-saving device. Here, our native trees are adapted to extreme droughts, extreme periods of flooding, and they will shed their leaves at the right time when the ground is so dry from drought that even the rocks no longer have any stored moisture, and they therefore live. And it saves you money from having to keep them alive using expensive city water. And there are more subtle things as well. Native trees also attract native insects, and some of our birds are insect eaters. And also some of the chemistry in native leaves are fertilizer themselves. The West Indian mahogany is an iron factory. You can actually rake up the leaves and put it around fruit trees like carambola star fruit that have a high need for iron. The poisonwood, its leaves are rich in manganese and so forth. And there's a whole area of science that's yet to be fully expounded for us laymen. But you have beauty and you have trees that are adapted. And each time you plant a native tree, you have most perfectly restored that little piece of earth.
Okay, that's wonderful. Yeah, and I like to think about it as being kind of a partnership between the birds and the plants, where the plants are feeding the birds, but the birds are also providing services in terms of spreading seeds and pollinating and so forth. So it's really a wonderful system. All right, so let's move on to our next question. What I would like to ask our panelists is, what, in your opinion, are some of the best all-around native plants for birds? You know, of course, there's many that are out there, but if you had to make a top 10 list, could you talk to us a little bit about some of those plants? And I'd like to ask Joe to show a few slides for us and talk about a few plants.
Okay, well that of course was a very difficult question, given that there are a lot of options. So what I tried to do in this list of 10 plants is I tried to point out some plants that not only grow well, of course, in the Bahamas, but they grow well throughout the Caribbean. And I focused primarily, at least for the rest of the Caribbean, on the coastal plain. And so I'm going to start first with one of my favorites, the gumbo limbo, or el masigo in Espanol. West Indian birch is another common name. Camalame, of course, is the Bahamian name, and I think everybody knows it. It has a very distinctive reddish bark, and it does produce fruits. It will, in the height of a drought, drop all of its leaves, but it'll maintain its fruits. The fruits are used by migrant birds. In fact, white-eyed vireos, a migrant species, will actually set up territories and defend the fruit throughout the winter. And then resident birds feed on them. Pigeons love them. A diversity of birds feed on them, and the fruits last throughout the winter and into the early spring. So they're available for quite a long period. They do well in dry areas. So it's certainly a tree you may want to consider. Next slide, please. Another favorite of mine is the wild tamarind. This is not the introduced tamarind, but it's Lysoloma. There are two members of the genus, at least in the Bahamas. One of the reasons that I recommend this tree is because it attracts a lot of native insects and spiders, and it will produce fresh leaves with the earliest rains at the end of the winter or the beginning of the spring. And with that flush of new leaves, there's also a flush of insects. And we've seen a number of migrants during our studies in the Bahamas that will move from one wild tamarind to the next, foraging on those insects. So this is a tree to consider for your yard. It doesn't get terribly large, and it has a rather thin canopy. It's quite attractive. The flowers, of course, will attract bees and butterflies and hummingbirds and banana quits. Occasionally Cape May warblers will feed on those flowers. So a very, very useful tree, and the important message here is that it's useful particularly in the spring migration when these birds have high protein needs. Next slide, please. The ficus or the figs are a very important group for birds. I have to caution in the use of them. As many of you may know, their roots will and can damage foundations and driveways and sidewalks. So you really want to focus on the types of figs that are relatively tame. The example I use here is what's known as the shortleaf fig, or Ficus citrifolia. Produces a fruit that virtually all birds will feed on, migrants as well as residents. I'll go a step further and point out that I've seen laughing gulls fly inland to feed on the fruits of this tree. But it is a very useful tree for birds. It'll fruit throughout the year. So it's a tree to consider. However, you want to have a relatively large yard or garden for this particular tree. Next slide, please.
Joe, are you seeing the slide?
Next, please.
I did go to the next slide, the buccaneer or cherry palm.
Okay, it's not showing up on my screen, but buccaneer or cherry palm is a very slow-growing species. It's found throughout the Caribbean. A lot of the nurseries in the Caribbean carry it, as well as in South Florida. I'm a big fan of palm trees because they do very well after hurricanes. They can lose virtually all of their fronds and still recover. They may look awful, but they recover very quickly, and they will produce fruit. So they're quite resilient when it comes to hurricanes. This is a relatively small palm. As I said, it grows slowly, so you could put it in your garden. Even a relatively small garden produces fleshy fruits that migrants and resident birds feed on. There are other types of palms that you might consider. If you have a large property, the native royal palms can be excellent for a diversity of birds, including migrants. However, you need to have a large yard for a tree of that size. But at least the palmettos and the small palms, you should consider those because they are all producers of bird fruits. Next slide, please. A favorite of mine is the snowberry. You can see in the picture here why it's called snowberry. It produces a white fruit, very popular with a diversity of birds. And the interesting thing about it is that it tends to produce fruit in early winter and fall. So just as the migrants are coming in, it provides a food source. Generally by mid and late winter, the fruit has been taken by the birds, but it's very nutritious. We've actually done some nutritional studies on them, and it is very good for migrants and important for those migrants during the fall migration period. It tends to be scraggly. It has long runners. You can train it to a trellis, but you need to control it because it'll run all over the yard. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But it's a very, I think, attractive plant to consider. Fruit used by birds. The flowers are popular with various bee species. Next slide, please. Tetrazygia bicolor, known as wild guava, is in the Melastomaceae, the melastome family. And the melastome family is a large family of mostly shrubs, although a few small trees such as Tetrazygia, and they all produce fruits used by birds, very popular with migrants. Warblers, vireos will feed on them, orioles will feed on them, as will native species, including various tanagers, for example, and they're very popular, and they're also quite tasty for humans. And if you want to make a jam out of them, if you want to steal some food from the birds, you can do that. But wild guava is certainly worth considering, and you can grow it in a small yard. It doesn't need a lot of space, and you can train it, you can trim it, and it's a very good bird plant. Next slide, please. The firebush is popular for birds for two reasons. One is it produces a flower very popular with hummingbirds, bananaquits, occasionally Cape May warblers will feed on it. Cape May warbler is a migrant species. And so it's important for nectivores, but it also produces fruits that are eaten by a variety of birds. These are fleshy fruits, as you can see here on the left of the slide. So it's a very popular bush. It's in the coffee family. The coffee family has a number of shrub species that are very popular with birds. So you may want to consider Hamelia patens. It grows throughout both the Bahamas and the Caribbean. So it's should be easy to find in nurseries or in collections. Next slide, please. Cocoa plum, Chrysobelanus Icaco, or also known in Spanish as Icaco, is a very hardy plant. I recommend it if you live along the seacoast because it's very salt tolerant. It produces relatively large fruits, so it requires a relatively large frugivore. Orioles will feed on it, thrushes will feed on it, some of the larger vireos will take it, and pigeons, of course, will take it. It'll grow right next to the seaside. It can handle sea salt. It can handle dry conditions. It's very tough. And it also produces very thick foliage, which allows birds to have hiding places and nesting places for the resident species, and also places for the insectivores to forage. So the cocoa plum, or Icacos, is a worthy consideration, even for the smallest yard. Next slide, please. One of my favorites, and probably because the bird that I've studied a lot, the migrant Kirtland's warbler, feeds heavily on the black torch, as do a variety of other warblers, both native and migrant warblers. They feed heavily on these fruits, black shown here. They'll fruit throughout the year at different times. They may have very different phenologies, that is, different periods when they have their fruits available. Both native and migrants feed on them. This also is highly salt tolerant and can do well in a small yard as well as a large yard. It's generally a small shrub. I've seen a few that have gotten up to maybe 15 feet, but that's a very large one. Generally, they're less than that. And this would make a good addition to a garden for a lot of migrant birds. Next slide, please. And finally, I have a slide here of wild sage, Lantana involucrata. This is a species very popular with birds, popular with the bird I study at least, as well as many other migrants and resident species. It's a very tough species. It doesn't need a lot of soil. It can withstand salt spray. It can handle droughts, and it will produce fruit and flowers throughout the year. And in other words, it'll just cycle in and out of flowers, fruits, several times a year. So your garden can have availability of nectar, such as these, as you can see in the little white flowers here. It is visited by hummingbirds. And then the fruits are taken by a diversity of resident and migrant birds. And as I said, it's a very tough species. In fact, if you put some trees or have some trees in your yard, don't be surprised if these volunteer. That is, they're dispersed into your yard by birds visiting your garden. And I think that's it. Okay.
Okay, that was great. Thank you, Joe. Wonderful. And just to let everybody know, we will be providing, making available this PowerPoint presentation downloadable on our website, and we hope also to be able to provide a recording of this presentation. So we'll follow up with you on that. All right, so the next question for our panelists is, how does one go about starting a native plant garden in their yard, in their backyard? What advice do you have? And Pericles, could you share with us first on this, please?
Right. Now, here in the Bahamas, when you start a yard, you're starting with stark, bare limestone ground, because the developers skin off everything, build your house, and then leave you with bare ground. And everybody has the dilemma. Well, we want a pretty garden, but we also want things to eat. And here we, conservationists, environmentalists, are saying to plant bush, in effect. And so I have some advice for everybody. First of all, start doing something. Get your land raked of rocks. Dig holes. If your treasury permits it, get in a small backhoe and break through the crust of rock so that roots can go down. If you can afford soil, bring in a little soil and put it into the pits where you plan to plant your network of trees. And then if you have family disagreement and people want things to eat as well, bananas, plant some bananas. They're not native, but banana quits, the nectar eaters, love them, and the plants will harbor lots of insects. And if you don't pick the bananas in time, the fruit eaters will eat them. Plant pigeon peas, full of flies and insects and so forth, which is why they don't use them in agricultural hedges anymore. But for birds, wonderful, and they fix nitrogen in the ground. You want fruit trees, a key lime in the Caribbean. Everybody needs a key lime. Very important for nesting birds, and I'm not telling you not to do that. Plant a key lime. Even the migrants may not use it as much, but the local birds will. And Brazilita, the one we have here in the Bahamas, it has heavy thorns all over it, becomes a snake-proof tree. Stick one in your ground, and later you can make tea. And for children, plant Barbados cherries, because they not only are wonderful vitamin C for the kids, but also they fruit several times a year. Birds love them. Plant those. If you have room in your garden, I'm dealing with a small garden, but if you have room, there are tropical fruits that we consider native, although they're not strictly native, at least not to the islands. The sapodilla, for example, will become a big, beautiful tree with insects, nectar, and fruit for fruit-eating birds. Mulberries, you catch them from cuttings, and they fruit in the winter, which is really famine time for a lot of migrants and natives. Wonderful for children. And a quick and easy thing, good for us people, but also wonderful for nectar eaters, are aloes. Okay, so there are things that you can plant that are not strictly bush, which will take care of that side of the family controversy. And then the native trees, it depends again on treasury, but it's very hard all over the Caribbean to find a big native tree in a pot to buy and end up with instant landscaping. In the whole Caribbean basin, it's really only the Florida nurseries that are held in producing large numbers of trees that are really native to other parts of the Caribbean, especially the Bahamas. But also for everyone who's listening, this is part of the future, to grow native trees as we get this spirit going. there's going to be a tremendous demand for native trees, and there are trees that Joe and I will talk about that people are going to say, how do I get one? And
Uh-oh, we seem to have lost Pericles.
Okay, you still there?
We seem to have lost Pericles. I'm not sure what happened to his audio.
And then start with whatever you can more that's available. The one that's easiest, I'll go in a second, the gamalame or the gumbo limbo. And whether you start with a small tree or you stick a branch in the ground, it will grow. And I applaud Joe for mentioning that tree, and if we have time later, we'll talk more about it. That's how you start. Cover with mulch, try and crack through with some kind of machinery or so that the roots will have a way to get down nearer to water and have a tap root that might survive strong winds, and then start with small trees and let them come up.
Okay, that's excellent. Joe, do you have anything to add?
Have I lost you? Hello?
Hello,
Yeah.
we still hear you. Joe, can you add any comment to Pericles?
Yeah, Pericles' comments were just excellent. Not a lot to add. There's a certain amount of build it and they will come. And by that I mean, if you get some plants out there, you have some perches, and once you have some perches, you're going to have some birds. And when you have some birds, you're going to have some seed dispersal, and you're going to have some volunteers. The way in which I got my gumbo limbo tree in my yard, which is now about 2 or 3 meters tall. It came in presumably by bird dispersal. A number of the native species in my yard have now come in by bird transport. So get some perches out there, and by perches you can start with small shrubs. And as Pericles said, you may want to go with some edible plants that may not be native, but keep the rest of the family happy. We're big on avocados, aguacates, and they're good for birds. They're non-invasive. We can eat them, but we can leave some of them up on the tree for the birds. So everybody wins on that one. So there's another species to consider. And then you can work on getting the natives. There is an effort here in Puerto Rico through the Botanical Garden and through some private gardens to make native species available. And I do think that with more pressure and encouragement that the nurserymen throughout at least the Greater Antilles, the larger islands at least, will begin to start to realize that there is an interest in native species. So I do think that that's important. The other thing to keep in mind is be careful what you decide to put in your yard. I know from experience, I convinced my wife to put in a couple of nice royal palms. We put them in as seedlings, but after about 12 years, when they were monsters, the roots took over the yard. My wife was ready to kill me because the root competition was pretty tough on the plants that she wanted, particularly the edible things. So keep those sorts of things in mind when you're selecting the plants for your garden.
Okay, those are all really great tips, Pericles and Joe. Thank you. And I know one member of our audience, Simon Guerrero, who's a big advocate for restoring habitats in the Dominican Republic. He has worked on bringing in just containers into schoolyards and just a container with a native plant. Within minutes, it's attracting migratory birds. So you don't even have to dig holes necessarily. You can even have container plants in your backyard and create habitat through that means as well. Okay, so we do have a couple questions from our audience that I wanted to pose to our panelists so that we can be as helpful as possible. And please go ahead and put your questions in the panel for questions, and we'll try to get to you in the last few minutes of our webinar here. So we had one question from Eric Salamanca in the Turks and Caicos Islands, And he's asking, how can you address unwanted seed dispersal of, say, of invasive species by birds? Is there anything that can be done about that? Tough question.
Well, you have to kill and kill and kill and try, and it's in some cases it goes on unendingly. I brought the first Brazilian pepperberry to my family farm when I was a boy, proud, ignorant. It was a beautiful exotic holly, we called it, and it grew into a huge tree. And every day of my life, I'm pulling up Brazilian pepperberries from under my mango trees, and it was a curse that I brought out to our Western district. But you just have to keep fighting. Theoretically, there could come a time when if you kill out all the seed trees, and then you kill out all the young trees for 3 years and until the seed bank runs out. But otherwise, it's a matter of eternal action and eternal vigilance to keep them under control.
Okay, great, thanks. We had a question from Gloria Archia in Puerto Rico, and she says that not all yards are large and that she recently moved into a house with a small yard, and she'd be really interested to know what small shrubs or plants would attract birds.
Well, as I said, the aloe, the Barbados cherry I'd put in anyway. Cocoa plums are beautiful shrubs. Go out and pick the best and the sweetest ones. Smaller is better for birds than the large varieties. If you can start from seed, or you can go under a tree and get seedlings up with as many roots as you can, and then wash off all the soil and stick them in water and change the water every day. Don't let it go sour, and some will die and others will put out new sprays of white roots, just like basil and other plants that you catch in water, and then you plant it. And once it starts growing, go back to the parent tree and get some leaf mold, because each cocoa plum has its own varieties of fungus that break down the leaves and make the plant enzymes and plant food. And so if you inoculate your young cocoa plums with the fungi and the microorganisms from the leaf mold under the parent tree, you'll greatly accelerate its growth. Or buy a big one if you have a nursery that has them. But that's one. Another one, in fact, Lisa, your great Professor McKinney, who trained you and sent you to us, once sat in my house, and a whole morning my wife had a strongback tree. Joe will have to give us the Latin name, but it has flowers and fruit, and the nectar eaters use it and the fruit eaters used it. And he told me that it was the most enjoyable morning of his life, because he counted 28 varieties coming to this shrub. It can get very tall and thin in a forest, but in the garden it can be kept as a nice light round shrub. That's a beautiful tree for a garden. And cinnamon, the Canella winterania, a beautiful tree, and its blossoms are first white and then they turn purple, so it looks like 2 sets of flowerings. And then its fruit are bright reds, and they're beautiful and they last a long time. And then the tanagers come down in the winter and they have a celebration on cinnamon. And that's a beautiful thick green shrub. Ironwood, the one we call black ironwood here, I can't tell you the Latin name, but it's a beautiful light tree, and it makes beautiful little black berries edible to people. The Lignum vitae, the Bahama one, is a less organized tree than the one that's common in Jamaica, that makes a lovely crown, and fruit eaters eat it in its season, and it's a beautiful tree. There are lots of smaller trees that can go into a garden. The cocoa plums the children will eat. The Barbados cherry the children will eat. Sea grapes can be kept down to hedge level, and low sea grapes will often hold their fruit even through a hurricane, and you'll have the white-crowned pigeons coming right into the to the heart of a city if there's a low-hanging sea grape after a hurricane. And, of course, people eat them with delight. And the list can go on, and hopefully there's going to be publications and means to help people classify all these lists.
Okay, that's wonderful, wonderful advice. And again, we'll be sharing the webinar, so if you weren't able to take notes on all that, we'll have it available for you. Okay, we have a couple more great questions in the queue, and let's try to get those in before we wrap up in the next 5 minutes. Cleo Pinder from Andros, Bahamas writes, I am purchasing a piece of property that is filled with a lot of sinkholes, and I was concerned. So what are you saying? Is this a blessing?
Are you asking?
I think you would say yes. We're asking you. I would say yes, right? Because you can use those holes to plant trees.
Yes, you can use those holes to plant trees, and that's how we do our farm. The prettiest ones you can leave as little miniature parks within your landscape. I don't know how much land you have, and I don't know how deep your holes are, but the ones on our farm, we fill in, and then we have like a giant planting pot. But some we still leave because they're so beautiful and they have ferns and so forth. My advice would be, don't go in with a bulldozer. Take your time. Learn to use a pruning saw instead of a cutlass or a machete. A pruning saw is the one that you cut on the pull and then you lift, and it's very easy, less labor intensive, and you don't split the branches that you're taking off. You cut them off clean and put your lawn up in the sky. In other words, underbrush underneath. Then cut out your house site and your driveway. Cut out places where you want to plant your trees, and leave the rest of the native canopy and thinned out and underbrushed, and eliminate some of the competition, and they'll grow into beautiful trees, especially around your boundaries. And then work on the ground cover. We haven't talked about ground cover plants, but you can make it beautiful. One that both Joe and I love is the golden creeper, the wild Enodia that grows all through the pine yard. And it will grow in disturbed land, and it'll grow in and give it sunlight, and it makes a tiny little berry, and it makes a tiny little pink flower, and that's the only thing in my observations that keep hummingbirds from extinction when there's a hurricane, because they're right on the ground, and so they have the shelter of rocks and wind and low bushes and so forth. So even after a hurricane, right away there's some food for bird life. And if you're talking about turning your garden lawn into the sky and then working on ground cover, the wild coffees that Joe mentioned, they will grow under the canopy, and they feed birds after hurricanes. And the gumbo limbo, the gamalame, even if you cut it down, it will stay alive for months and months. And in nature, when we do get a hurricane and the trees are broken up and the branches are broken up, they still hold their fruit. And without those laying on the forest floor, still holding their fruit after a hurricane, a lot of our species, I think, would never have survived the cycles of hurricanes that we get sometimes. So, Andros, don't put a bulldozer there. Take your time and use your sinkholes like the old people used to.
Okay, thank you, Pericles. Excellent comment. All right, so I just want to share one comment from Simon Guerrero, the person that I mentioned before that's working on restoring native plants in the Dominican Republic. He mentions that the first speaker showed a picture of Trima lamarckiana, and he's mentioning that Trima micrantha is also very good for all frugivorous native birds and for migrants, especially the Cape May warbler. So Trima micrantha, another species of Trima. We're going to take one last question with a quick answer from one of our panelists, and then we're going to wrap up. Hannah Madden from St. Eustatius asks, if some of the native species from your presentation are not normally found on our respective islands, would you recommend introducing them, or is that considered risky? Are the plants that you all mentioned not?
No, I wouldn't say risky. I think, yeah.
Go ahead.
You have the problem of plants being native to one island and not to others. And at some time, perhaps in some future Birds Caribbean conference, we all are going to need to put our heads together and see whether or not we can come up with some code. But I will tell you mine in advance. Any plant that is native in the area, which is of great value to birds on any islands, I think should be able to be used as landscape plants throughout the region. Anything certainly that a white-crowned pigeon eats, sooner or later, theoretically, will get everywhere, and I don't think we should be worried about it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I think you made the point earlier, and one of our audience members had this question.
Hello?
Yes, thank you, Pericles. And I think you made the point, you guys made the point earlier, and one of our audience members had this question that it's a great idea to yourself plant natives and encourage landscapers to plant native. But in some cases, exotics are fine too. They're not invasive, and they do provide fruit for birds and for people, and are ornamental and so forth. So some exotics are okay, but just make sure that they are not invasive. And any exotics that were mentioned today, I don't think are known to be invasive. Okay, so if you have more questions, please pose them, and we will answer them via email.
Can we say one more thing, Lisa?
Sure. Go ahead, Pericles.
Is there one? Oh, Lisa, what I was going to say was that trees that Joe, for example, mentioned, the ficus family, that have violent, adventurous roots that will lift your head up into the air and plug up your septic tank. They are still good for planting out in parks and open places and so forth. So not only be thinking about your garden and your little home site, but also think about neighborhoods, public land, public parks, these large trees that grow big and take really good care of birds. Wonderful to create woodlands and shadelands in parks around neighborhoods, because they in turn will help the whole neighborhood be a stronger ecosystem for migratory and native birds. I once saw a flock of bobolinks come down from out of sight, dive bombed into a strangler fig, the Ficus aureorea, that was full of ripe fruit, and they were on migration. I think it was late April or May, and out of the clear blue sky descends this huge flock of birds, and they took over the tree joyfully and ate, and then they continued on their migration. So you remember that story.
That's wonderful, Pericles, and I'm sure we could talk all day about this subject. There's so much to learn, and you guys have been fantastic. So it's time to wrap up, and I just wanted to share with you that we do have a downloadable ebook that we're going to be making available in a couple days about heritage plants, some native trees and plants for birds and people. So look for that on our website, and if you're not on our listserv, please sign up on our Yahoo group, Birds Caribbean, so you can be notified of resources like this. So I would like to just thank again Scott Johnson, Joe Wunderle, Pericles Maillis, and the Bahamas National Trust for hosting us for this session that provided so many important insights on the importance of native plants for birds and how to set up a bird-friendly backyard. Also, thank you to our participants for being so engaged and for sending in your questions. Again, email us your questions and we will answer them, and we will continue the conversation. So please follow us, our IMBD activities on Facebook, and you can post your feedback and comments on our IMBD Festival under the announcement for this webinar. So thanks again to Scott and our distinguished panelists, and thank you everyone for your interest in Caribbean birds and native plants for birds, and for attending this webinar. Have a great day.